The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good morning everybody. This is our lecture on the human endocrine system, and it's a follow-on from yesterday's lecture on the nervous system. So if we remember our theme that we introduced when we talked about homeostasis, all the processes in the body that are acting to correct it use this loop of feedback. And if you remember, when we talked yesterday about the nervous system, we said that the nervous system was one of the body's communication systems, connecting sensors, integrators and effectors together. Now there's another communication system in the body, and that is one which doesn't use electrical connections. It's one that uses chemical connections, uses a range of chemical signals. Now traditionally we've termed this chemical connection as being the endocrine system, and a system that uses chemicals known as hormones. However, over the past 100 years or so, we've rationalized our view of chemical signaling in the human body. We now know that it's much more complicated than just a few hormones signaling and changing the body's processes. So we have some more modern definitions of chemical signaling in the body, and I've put them on this slide. Of course, there's always the hormones. Hormones such as insulin, which you probably all know about, that act all over our body, that act at the level of the body. And just like we mentioned before when we looked at things working at different levels in the body, we found that chemical signaling works at those levels too. So we also recognize now that there are a series of what we call paracrine signals. Now these are chemical signals working only at a single organ or a level of a tissue, and we might see some of those later on when we talk about the types of hormones that exist. More excitingly, in the last 30 years or so, we understand that cells themselves signal, and that signal is kept at the level of the cells. So it's like a chemical chit-chat between individual cells in the body. This is quite important. This sort of autocrine signaling is the way in which cells make sure that they're in the right place, make sure that they're working correctly together as a group, and also make sure that nothing bad is happening in the tissue that they're living. So autocrine signals, and we've probably identified tens of thousands of those individual signals by now, are very, very important. Now the other thing that's come along and confused our definitions of chemical signaling is that we now know that the nervous system itself produces some very powerful signals. So for instance, when you damage yourself, you bash yourself or crush yourself or stab yourself, then you damage nerve endings in the process. And those nerve cells can actually produce chemical signals which then start the process of inflammation. So we now know there's a whole range of chemical signals in the body. So when we look at body communication and when we look at body control, we can see two real levels. So this is our old view of chemical signaling. So we understand that there was a central control, just like the Westminster government has control over us individually, and a local control in the body, just like Plymouth City Council has over the people who live in Plymouth. And this was our old view, that it was a largely central control, a whole body control over processes that were going on, and that there was some local control which worked out processes such as perhaps inflammation and immune reactions. Now, as our developing knowledge of chemical signaling has moved on, we probably now would see chemical signaling in the body as having this relationship. We actually probably now, through our studies of things like cancer and diseases of various tissues of the body, we can see that the level of signaling is much more down at the local level. So there's much more local control than we actually originally thought. And whilst we still have central control from certain hormones and certain important hormones, there's an awful lot of internal control. We'll see that complexity in a little while. Okay, so on this slide here, this is a picture of the body, a line drawing, and it explains the major hormone secreting cells in the body. So this is the key set of tissues responsible for major hormones in our body. And we'll start up at the top here. Up at the top here, if you remember, we had a discussion yesterday about parts of the brain. And one of those key parts of the brain was the hypothalamus. And if you remember, we could identify different parts of that hypothalamus that were responsible for sensing all sorts of changes in the body. Thirst, body temperature, hunger, etc., etc., blood pressure, a whole range of different things. And the hypothalamus is key to our understanding of homeostasis. And it is probably the hypothalamus is probably the homeostatic center of our body. It coordinates and controls homeostatic mechanisms by the fact that it receives so much information from the sensory parts of our body. Okay, now next to the hypothalamus, and we'll be seeing this later on, is a little structure called the pituitary, or the pituitary gland. That's a major player in hormone secretions in the human body. Now let's move down, and down here we have the this is the voice box or larynx, okay, and we can see the cartilage around it here. Just below the larynx, wrapped around it, are a series of glands, the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. Thyroid hormone is a key metabolic regulator in the body, and parathyroid hormone plays an important role in things like calcium homeostasis. Down here is a rather sort of ill-defined organ, which is actually a very diffuse set of tissues in older people. It is more prominent in younger people, called the thymus. Now the thymus is responsible for the processing of immune cells. It also produces a number of different chemical controls, thymic controls over the immune system. Now moving down here, some of the key glands responsible for producing hormones and body chemicals are the adrenal glands here. You can see them sat like little hats on top of the kidney. Now they produce a whole range of hormones, which we will see later on. The kidney itself, which produces chemical controls responsible for changes in blood pressure and fluid control. And here the pancreas, very important organ in the body. The pancreas not only produces secretions for digestion, as we will see next week, it also produces some major hormones for the control of metabolism, insulin being one, glucagon being the other, but we'll talk about that later. Now down here, down in the genitourinary region, we have the reproductive organs, and as you probably know, the reproductive hormones are produced from these regions and coordinate reproduction, the development and childbirth. So these are important organs, which we won't be mentioning too much today. Okay, so having seen that the body produces a wide range of hormones, there is a definition of hormones that's existed now for over a century. This is a definition. The definition is that a hormone is a substance produced by cells in one part of the body that is secreted into the body's fluids in amounts related to the strength of its stimulus and has action some distance from the site of its secretion at the hormone's target tissue. Okay. Now, in understanding hormones, we probably need to understand a few things from this definition. So the first thing is, and we've just already sort of covered it in the previous slide, is that hormones are produced by cells in one part of the body. And we've seen some of the places in which hormones are produced. The other thing that we need to know about hormones is that they're secreted into the body fluids. So they go directly into the body fluids. And this is why hormone system is called the endocrine system. Endocrine meaning secreted within or into the body. There's another term called exocrine, which is secreted out, and we will come across that when we look at digestion, because a lot of the secretions of digestive fluid go out of the body into the digestive tract, and that's exocrine secretion. Okay, now the next thing that we need to do is that we need to know a little bit from this definition what's it meant by strength of its stimulus. So what is a stimulus for a hormone? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the key thing, and we'll just spend some time talking about it now, is the actions of what we call the hormone's target tissue. Okay, and this is an important concept in chemical signaling, because the human body at any one time is absolutely flooded with chemical signals. Now, how do those signals work specifically then, if we can find them all over the body? Well, they work by acting on this target tissue. I think a good way to explain it is in the next diagram. So this is a cell, okay? This is a cell. It's like my favorite fried egg type of cell. And this area here is the nucleus, okay? So that's the control center of the cell. So if this cell is going to change in any way, then it's going to have its nucleus stimulated. Anyhow, let's start with our first concept in cell signaling. That for a cell to respond or to be a target cell, first of all, it has to receive a message from the outside. And that message then needs to be received, and generally it's received at the outside of the cell here, although there are some special cases where that message gets received inside. But this is the hormone attaching to its target cell. Then we get something called a second message, which is once the first message has been received, there's a certain amount of decoding going on inside the cell through processes, enzyme reactions, the release of substances like ions and calcium and things like that. And then when that message reaches the nucleus, we then get a cell response. So this is the key set of stages in cell signaling. First of all, a cell, to be able to respond, must be able to receive the first message. It then needs to convert that first message into a response via a series of second messages. Now, actually, this is exactly the same as what we were talking about before when we talked about information transfer in the body. That because it is just information transfer, then we can see parallels and examples of this type of signaling everywhere we look in the world. So the concepts of information transfer and decoding are universal. And so, because they're universal, we can actually find a modern day equivalent of hormone signaling or chemical signaling in the body. Hormone action and chemical signaling can be seen as the same as satellite TV. That sounds strange, you say. Why is it? Well, when you walk down the street, you see all these satellite receivers on the outside of people's houses. Perhaps not as colourful as these, but you see them. Now, the only reason that they're there is because they enable the people in those houses to receive satellite signals. Everybody in the street could receive satellite signals, but they need a receiver to do that. And that's exactly the same as cells in the body. Cells need receivers to receive specific chemical signals. If they don't have the right receivers, they don't get the right signals. Now, the next thing that satellite TV provides us an analogy with hormone action is that once those signals are received, so once the signals are received by these dishes, nothing really can happen until that signal is decoded and interpreted. Yeah? So they're all receiving signals from satellites in outer space, and nothing's going to happen until they're decoded. So the signal passes into your house via a cable. That cable then attaches to your satellite box or satellite decoder, which might be in the television, and then that decoding takes place. So once decoding takes place inside your sky box or whatever, then something can happen. Then you get your image. So once decoding has taken place, then you get your response. So you can get an action from that signal. And this is exactly the same as with hormones and body cells. For a body cell to receive a hormone signal, it has to have the right receivers, and it also needs to be able to decode the information passed to it to produce a measurable action or process. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at that in reality. So first of all, we're going to have a look at receivers, and we're going to have a look at second messengers. So we're going to have a look at the receiver and the decoder. Okay, so what we see on here, this is a line drawing, and just to orientate you to what's going on here, this is the inside of a cell. Okay, and this here, this layer that we can see here, is the outer membrane of that cell. Okay, now the receivers for hormone signals are given a specific name, and they're actually called receptors. So receptor, so instead of receiver, they're called receptor. Really it means a reception unit, a receptor, so it's an appropriate name. So here are the receptors. The receptors are sat in the membrane of the cell, and you can see here how the first messenger, here and here, the hormone, one here, one here, passes the message to the cell by attaching to that receptor. There and there. So that's the first reaction. We've just seen that on that crude diagram I saw earlier. That's the first message, and this one indicates that it's the first start of the process. Now the next thing that happens, and it doesn't matter which receptor is there needs to be a decoding process. So you can see here, following steps 2, 3, and 4, and 5, there is a series of chemical reactions. Now you don't need to know these. You don't need to know what is going on here. But you just need to understand that the hormone signal is then processed via some chemical reactions in the cell to then trigger the cell to respond. Okay. Now the second messenger that is used provides very important signaling within inside the cell. And there's a whole range of different types of second messenger, and we may see some of those later. So this is a general view of hormone signaling. If we go to the next slide, we'll see a specific hormone signaling pathway in action. Oop, I forgot my numbers. Anyhow, so this is a diagram that shows you the action of insulin. And you might look at it and say, well, it looks a little bit like what was going on before, but it just shows you that basic principle applies. So let's have a look here. So insulin, the hormone, for it to work, it has to attach to the insulin receptor. Okay, the insulin receptor. Okay, so it has attached to the insulin receptor, which is here. The next stage in the process, so let's do a 1 here and a 2 here, is the decoding of that event. Now you can see the decoding of that event following this process here. Now you don't really need to know at all what's going on here or what these chemicals are, but what you do need to know is at the end of the process, at the end of the decoding of the second message, there's an action, and it is a very simple action which places a glucose transporting protein into the membrane of the cell. So cells respond to insulin by putting glucose transport proteins into the cell. So here's the glucose transport protein here. And that means the glucose is able to come from outside of the cell into the cell. And this is how insulin reduces glucose in the blood, by making cells generate glucose transporters. And these glucose transporters then take glucose out of the blood, out of the body fluids, into the cell. So this is an incredibly good example of a hormone action. It shows you the first message here, the second message here, and the response here. So you can see there's a simple hormone pathway, although it may not look simple to you. The basic principles apply. Let's have another look. Okay, now this is the pathway of a steroid hormone. Now we'll talk about the steroid hormones later, but the sort of things that we're talking about here is cortisol and the reproductive hormones like estrogen. Okay, they're steroid hormones. Now steroid hormone, the first message, slightly different because the receptor for a steroid hormone is inside the cell. But it is still a first message. There's still a connection between the hormone and its receptor. Okay, it's a slightly more direct process than before, but you still have this first message. You then have a second message, and then you have a response. Okay, and in this case, steroids basically, in this case, produce through transcription of RNA a new protein. So it's still a cell response. So just like we've been talking about all the time in these biology lectures, they are very simple principles. The complication comes because there are just so many variations on these simple principles. Now the next slide might be a little worrying to you, so I suggest you take a deep breath and then have a look at it. Okay, so this is a slide, and it's not one I at all want you to remember. Just shows you the things we now understand about cell signaling. Okay, but what I want you to see is that we know it doesn't matter what type of cell signaling it is, that the whole series of receptors. Okay, so there's a whole series of receptors here, and you can see them here. These are all different types of receptors. Okay, some of the key ones that you'll find. Okay, some of these are only active when you're developing embryo. Others are only switched on rarely. But some of them are the major ways in which your body communicates. And they make a really, really big impact into cell processes. And most of the modern biomedical research, particularly in things like cancer and pathology of inflammation and immune responses and controlling disease states, is done at this level now, because we understand that all of the processes of the body are driven by cell processes, and cell signaling is incredibly important. So a lot of these proteins that you probably won't understand are vital proteins in our understanding of key cellular processes, including when cellular processes go wrong. So for instance, this protein up here called the RAS protein was one of the very, very first proteins, cell signaling proteins, that we could associate with cancer. It was one of the very first proteins, a long, long time ago, about 60 years ago. We also now know that a whole range of these different signaling pathways are common. That is, that they may use different receptors up here, but then they may use the same pathway. And if you follow the arrows here, you can see that they actually can join up, and actually the same pathway can be started by a number of different first messages. Okay? So for instance, you can see up here for this type of receptor, GPCR, which is the long name for it is G protein coupled receptor, it does an awful lot of the signaling in the body. Okay. So hopefully what we've seen so far today is that chemical signals are important because they control body processes. We've also seen that chemical signaling is quite simple to understand because it requires the interaction and communication of chemical signals with specific cells or target cells. And a target cell is a target cell because it has the apparatus to receive and decode the chemical signal. Remember what we said about satellite television. So just like the fact that if you have a skybox and a dish, you can get sky, and your next door neighbor doesn't have one, so can't get sky, this is why some cells can get signals and other cells can't. The signals are all around us, it's just that you need the apparatus to decode it. Okay, let's move on and have a look now at the types of hormones that we find in the body. So we're going to give a brief overview of the different chemical types. Okay, so first of all we're going to talk about a class of hormones called the peptide hormones. Now those of you that have done biology before will have understood that a peptide is a series of amino acids. And these diagrams here show you that. So these like strings of beads are strings of amino acids. Now the two hormones we see on this page are insulin and glucagon. And the key thing to remember about these is that they are chains of amino acids. And you can see that here. Chains of amino acids joined together. Okay, so they're quite small molecules. Now both of these hormones, both of these peptide hormones, insulin and glucagon, are produced in one place, and that's in the pancreas. And we've seen that before. We saw on the homeostasis diagram where we were discussing sensors and integrators and effectors, we saw blood glucose reactions using insulin and glucagon. Now inside the pancreas, and here in this square here, is a microscope slide of the inside of the pancreas, are special regions, and they're little islands of different types of cell. Now they don't call them islands, we call them islets. And because they were discovered by an anatomist called Langerhans, they're known as the islets of Langerhans. Now these two hormones are produced in these cells. So insulin is produced by beta cells and glucagon by alpha cells. And both beta and alpha cells can be found in the islets of Langerhans. So these two hormones are produced in these cells in the pancreas. Now there's another peptide hormone which is very important, and there's a lot of interest in it, and that is oxytocin. So oxytocin is again a peptide hormone. It has a chain of amino acids. And only a few, only 9 amino acids. Oxytocin is produced in the pituitary gland, and we'll see that later. Here's the pituitary gland. We'll see that later. Now oxytocin, those of you that have had children probably understand this is the hormone that controls labour and controls the contraction of the uterus. But oxytocin is also very powerful in emotions. And we know that oxytocin can drive all sorts of behaviours. It's often called the hormone of love, and that's why I added a few hearts to this diagram just to emphasize that. But it is a peptide hormone, simple series of amino acids acting as a signal in the body. Okay, the next group of hormones I want to talk about are what we call the catecholamines. Okay, the catecholamines. Now the catecholamine hormones are produced in the adrenal gland. Now we saw these earlier. They're like little hats sitting on top of the kidneys. Okay, they're very important endocrine glands because they secrete a whole range of different hormones. So you can see here, they secrete a whole range of different hormones. But we're just interested in this case, the catecholamines. So what are the catecholamines? Well, they're all produced from one amino acid called tyrosine here. They're produced part of a process manufacture, and they are known as, in America, they're known as norepinephrine and epinephrine, or in Britain we call these adrenaline and noradrenaline. Okay, so perhaps you understand now that the pens that people get given to try and combat allergy or anaphylactic shock are called EpiPens because they contain adrenaline. They're not called AdreniPens, largely because it's an American company that make them. So it's the same hormone, but with different names at different sides of the Atlantic. Okay, adrenaline literally means the hormone made in the adrenals, and epinephrine is the hormone made around the kidney. Okay, adrenaline is more specific because it tells you exactly where it was made, not just any place around the kidney, actually in the adrenal glands. Okay, so these are the catecholamine hormones, all derived from one amino acid called tyrosine. Okay, the next set of hormones, again chemically similar and modified from amino acids, are the thyroid hormones. So the thyroid hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, and they're produced from this gland called the thyroid gland here back in the neck. The next class of hormones are steroid hormones. So these are what we know as the steroid hormones. Steroid hormones. And this looks like a very, very, very complicated diagram, but it's effectively explaining to you that they're all chemically similar and they all derive from one thing, cholesterol. Okay. Now there's a lot of controversy about cholesterol, but you can't deny the fact it's a vital fat for the body. It's a vital substance because it is the building block for all of these different types of hormone. So let's have a look at this. Now, if you have a look at the label of, say for instance, the contraceptive pill, you'll see some of these names. Okay? You will also, so these are names of that you will find. Also, you might be aware of this hormone, testosterone, the male defining hormone. Okay, it's a wave of testosterone that defines a male from a female in human development. Cortisol, we'll talk about cortisol later on. Cortisol is a stress hormone. And cortisone, you probably have heard of hydrocortisone, which is a variation of this. This is a anti-inflammatory hormone. And another one you'll hear of later is aldosterone. Aldosterone is a hormone responsible for sodium and water balance in the body. So you can see that the estrogens are actually a very diverse group of hormones. They're produced in various parts of the body, but mainly in the cells of the ovary. And the arrows that I'm drawing here are showing you where the tissues of the ovary are. This here is an ovarian follicle. So this is a developing egg. Okay. So estrogen is produced during this phase. It is an important part of the reproductive process. But this diagram is just to show you the steroid configuration, all derived from cholesterol. Okay. This is the final group of hormones I want to talk about. And they're different in the way that they're actually a group of hormones with many, many different actions in the body with the same similar chemical structure. But they're a good example of local hormones or paracrine hormones working in a particular region or tissue. Now there's a list here of properties or actions that we know to be associated with prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are important because they take part in important processes like pain and inflammation. They also take part in things like muscle constriction. So we use prostaglandins to induce labor, for instance. So they're very important hormones, but they act at a local level. And they do many, many different things. Okay. So, let's move on and talk about how hormones are controlled. Because we had a look now at how they work. So we had a look at what their target tissue effects are. So we know what they do, how they work at the target tissue. The thing that we want to know about now is, first of all, how are they stimulated? How does a hormone get stimulated to be produced in the first place? And how and when and where are they secreted from? So this is an important part of our understanding of hormone action. So let's have a look first of all at stimuli. What is it? How is it that hormones are released? What stimulates them? Well, there are basically three stimuli for hormone secretion. Okay? The first stimulus is what we call a humoral stimulus. That is that the tissue secreting the hormone senses a change in the blood. So for instance, the levels of calcium in your body are detected by cells in your parathyroid hormone. And when that changes, they then respond by producing the hormone to change your homeostasis. So that's what we call a humoral stimulus. A stimulus that has come from the blood. Okay. The second type of stimulus is a neural stimulus. Okay. We probably all know how powerful adrenaline is. It gets the heart racing, it makes us alert. It's a very, very powerful hormone. We secrete adrenaline largely to the response of nervous stimuli. So for instance, sensory stimuli that get us excited, that get us activated. So that's an example of nervous stimulation. But equally, parathyroid hormone can be stimulated through that too. Now the other way in which you stimulate hormone secretion is via hormones themselves. So you can use hormones to stimulate hormones to stimulate hormones, and we'll see that in action in a minute. And the type of hormone that stimulates another hormone is called a trophic hormone. And we'll see how that works in the next slide. Okay. Now, this is a relatively simple hormone loop. It is the loop that defines the process of the production of cortisol as a response to stress. Okay? So, stress is detected in the body, whether that be emotional or physical stress, damage, pain, whatever. It's sensed in the brain, in that part of the brain you remember called the hypothalamus, which is the sensory area for just about everything. The hypothalamus then produces a hormone called CRH, or corticotrophin releasing hormone, which then stimulates the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then produces another hormone called corticotrophin. Now if you remember, then this word trophin indicates it's a trophic hormone. That means that it's a hormone that stimulates the production of another hormone. That hormone then goes to the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands then secrete cortisol. Cortisol then circulates around the body, and when its levels are high enough, and when the effects of stress pass off, then this loop closes down. So it's a pretty regular homeostatic feedback loop. But it shows you how hormones work. They generally work from a stimulus, then via a series of chemical signals to control them in the body. Okay. So let's move on to what I think is probably the most important hormone-producing tissue of the body. It's also an incredibly important link between the nervous system, as we discussed yesterday, particularly the brain, and the endocrine system. So this is the pituitary. It sits as a stalk at the sort of base of the hypothalamic region in the brain, and it is made up of two parts: the anterior or front-facing part of the pituitary and the posterior or rear-facing part of the pituitary. They're given different Latin names, which are quite useful when you understand their meaning. So, the kidney is also known as the hypophysis, or the hypophyses. Okay? So you can see that in that name. The front part is called the adenohypophysis, and the rear part is called the neurohypophysis. Why am I teaching those long names? Well, for a very simple reason. Because this prefix here, adeno, represents that this is a gland. Anything adeno relates to a gland. And neuro, as you probably know now because you're all anatomical experts, relates to nerve. So it tells you that this part of the pituitary here is glandular, and it's made of glandular tissue, and this part of the pituitary here comes from nervous tissue. If we have a look at the two types, we can see under a microscope how different they are. So this is typically the type of tissue you see in the anterior pituitary, glandular, lots of secretory cells. Whereas here, in the posterior pituitary, lots of nerve cells. Lots of nerve cells. You can see spider-like projections here and here and here and here. Lots of nerve cells. So the pituitary gland, or pituitary, is an important bridge between nervous and hormone secretory processes. So it's very, very important. On the next slide, we can have a look at that. So let's just explain, okay, let's just explain here what this diagram is. Effectively, it's a picture of the pituitary. You can see pituitary here, okay, and you can see anterior and posterior pituitary here, and it explains how the two sides are controlled, and also down here at this level what hormones are produced by the different parts of the pituitary. So let's have a look. First of all, let's have a look at the posterior neural origin part of pituitary. You can see that nerve cells from the hypothalamus project down into here. The hormones that are produced from the posterior pituitary are actually produced up here in the hypothalamus, and then they're transported down to the posterior pituitary and then into the blood vessels to go around the rest of the body. And the two key hormones are oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Very, very important hormones. Actually, when you look at the two of them, they're almost chemically similar. I think there's only one amino acid difference between the two peptide hormones. But these are the two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary. However, if we go over and look at this side over here and have a look at the anterior pituitary, we will see that it produces a whole host of different hormones. Okay? And that's because it's a glandular tissue. It produces lots and lots of glandular secretions. It is stimulated by releasing hormones. So the hormones themselves are made down here, but they're actually signaled from up here in the hypothalamus. And for these to be released, for these hormones, all these hormones to be released from the pituitary, they need to have signals from the hypothalamus to do that. Okay? So what we're seeing here is a very, very important bridge between the nervous system and the hormonal system. The nervous system is receiving the information about changes in the body. It is then signaling via neurosecretions to the pituitary to then secrete hormones to control those processes. And here are the different types of hormones. Thyroid hormone, cortisol, reproductive hormones, growth hormones, hormones associated with reproduction, hormones associated with pain control. So you can see that the pituitary gland is central to our understanding of hormones. Okay, now this is a complicated diagram, and I'm not going to try and make it overcomplicated for you. I just think that after this lecture, when you've got some time, you should go and see how hormones are produced and the types of hormones that are produced from the pituitary and how they're controlled from the brain. So what I want you to notice is that the hypothalamus here is a part of the brain, and the hypothalamus is connected directly to the posterior pituitary because, as we said, it is part of the nervous tissue. However, it is not connected directly to the anterior pituitary So to communicate with that, it uses a series of releasing or inhibiting hormones which control that part of the pituitary gland. Over here, you'll see that these are all the different types of hormones associated with the pituitary. So the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and ADH, anterior pituitary, growth hormone, prolactin, MSH, the sex hormones, gonadotrophins, cortisol, ACTH, adrenocorticotrophic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. And what you'll notice as well is just as the hypothalamus connects with the anterior pituitary then connects with the different hormone secreting tissues in the body, such as the thyroid, the adrenal cortex, and the gonads or reproductive organs. So there's this pathway, and we saw it earlier, this very defined pathway of signaling between different parts of the body. Okay. Now, remember I said how the hypothalamus was key to this. The hypothalamus up in the brain is the key to this control. It is through the hypothalamus that changes in the body are sensing, and that sensing is then turned into action via the release of hormones. So if you have a look, what we're seeing here is that we're seeing that different parts of the brain, so up here is telling you that different parts of the brain above the hypothalamus communicate with it. So things like the optical system, the limbic system, which is the emotional part of the brain, thalamic pain centers, and consciousness, all of these act and influence the hypothalamus. But within the hypothalamus, there's also another range of body processes that are all being controlled. Temperature, energy and hunger, blood pressure, cardiovascular system, water balance, all of these things are being controlled within the hypothalamus. It sends its signals, whether they be nervous or hormonal signals, to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland then secretes its various hormones in response. Okay, so let's just reflect now how this relates to homeostasis, because as I've said all along, homeostasis is the key to understanding the human body. So up here we have our sensor. This is the brain. It's sensing all the changes that are happening in the internal and the external environment. Okay? Those nervous signals are interpreted then in the hypothalamus, integrated, the strength of the stimulus is detected, whether or not it's a dangerous change, etc., etc. And then, if action is needed, then the secretion of hormones occurs, and we have our effector. Okay, so that simple sensor, integrator, effector loop is here, just as it is with every other part of the body. So as you can see, hormones are key parts of body regulation. There's a number of different hormones. They act on different processes, but they are key communicators in homeostasis. Now, there's some other body hormones on the next slide. Now I've put hormones here in parentheses because are they hormones? We call them hormones, or are they just basic body signals? Okay, but we do know that throughout other tissues there are other controlling signaling molecules, and we'll come across some of those, particularly in the digestive system, where you'll understand that they're actual local hormones which alter the processes going on in digestion. Other things, so for instance, the production of red blood cells is by a hormone called EPO, which is in the kidney. And the kidney again can control blood pressure through the secretion of a substance called renin. And what we now know, as I said in the very first slide, is that the body is controlled by chemical signals at all levels. Okay, so this is our final slide for today. It really emphasizes how important hormones are to homeostasis, because hormone disorders, particularly its key hormones, can have dramatic effects on the body. Perhaps one of the most important hormone deficiencies or hormone disorders is diabetes. Diabetes through the loss or insensitivity to insulin. So let's have a look at this. So insulin, decreased insulin, can be produced. Sorry, the effects of decreased insulin either come from reduced secretion of insulin or reduced sensitivity to insulin. It matters not. It is still the same process. And if you look at these arrows, you can see exactly what happens. So for instance, over here, if there's a decreased glucose availability to cells because insulin is not present to put those glucose transporters into the membranes, then cells become deprived of energy. What we then get is changes in the body, for instance, because we can't use glucose to metabolize, we shift to fat metabolism, which then might lead to a whole range of different things, such as ketone body production, weight loss, or hyperlipidemia, too much fat in the blood. That in itself, hyperlipidemia, can lead to things like gallstones, and in time to cardiovascular disease, which in turn can lead to ulcers, gangrene, kidney damage, retinopathy. The shift to fat metabolism can lead to coma through ketoacidosis. So as you can see, insulin, a hormone, metabolic hormone, vital in maintaining the whole. So it has its role as a homeostatic agent. You don't need to see that. Okay, so in today's session, what we've looked at are hormones. What you should understand now is that hormones are important chemical signals in the body, that they can be seen as agents of homeostasis. They work by changing body processes. They are specific because they act on target tissues, and their action at target tissue is similar. That they're required to be a first message, second messages, and then a response. And it doesn't matter what hormone it is, they'll all have that same process. And if you remember, we introduced the idea that chemical signaling in the body was like receiving satellite TV. The signals may be all around you, but without the receivers or receptors and the decoding system, the second messengers, you can't receive the signal to get the response that you want. We then had a look at some different types of hormones. We decided that there were a number of chemically different types of hormones, and we gave some examples, such as the peptide hormones, the catecholamines, etc., etc. We had a look at how hormones are stimulated, how their secretion is stimulated. We've also had a look at how they're controlled. And hormone secretion is generally controlled by feedback loops, often containing other hormones or chemical signals. We've had a look at the pituitary gland and seen that it is made of two types of tissue, nervous tissue and glandular tissue, and that overall the pituitary gland is stimulated by neurological events in the brain and hypothalamus in response to body changes. We've also had a look at the different types of hormones that are produced in the body and some of their actions. And as I said, some of that may need you to do some further reading to understand those, or to go back to it when you need to, when you encounter these hormones in your other studies. But the basic principle of the endocrine system is it is one of the body's communication system. It provides the links between different homeostatic processes and controls the different homeostatic processes in the body. Okay, next time we meet, we will be investigating the joys of the cardiovascular system.